Cold Larch Draw, Northern Wyoming Territory. Late autumn, 1889. From the dusty wagon road, Keziah Thornby's horse barn looked no different from any other frontier building. A low roof, wind-gray boards, an oat straw loft stacked high, 3 horses and 1 old mule shifting quietly inside. Nothing about it invited a second look, but beneath those worn floorboards, a widowed mother was digging a bedroom. By January 1890, the hardest blizzard the valley had ever endured would bury cabins, silence chimneys, and freeze ordinary homes into iceboxes. Yet the strangest shelter in Cold Larch Draw would still be warm, because the wind could never find what waited below. Keziah Thorneby was 34 years old when she stopped believing that another ordinary winter would spare her family. She lived alone with her 2 children, 10-year-old Caleb and 7-year-old Mira, on a small homestead at the edge of Cold Larch Draw. Her husband, Harlan Thorneby, a local builder known for repairing roofs, setting fence posts, raising barns, and keeping weather outside where it belonged, had died of pneumonia 2 winters earlier. Nobody had ever taught Keziah to build. She had simply watched. She remembered the habits that mattered. Water always needed somewhere to go. Wind had to be stopped before it reached the living space. Heavy loads demanded solid support beneath them. Harlan rarely explained those lessons. Years of quiet observation had done the work instead. The previous winter nearly took Mira as well. The little girl had coughed until her lips lost their color. Night after night, Keziah fed the fire while counting the shrinking stack of split cottonwood beside the cabin. Nearly an entire winter's supply disappeared before February was over, and still the cold settled across the floor before sunrise. Mira survived, but only after weeks of fever, blankets, and exhausted nights beside the hearth. When autumn returned in 1889, Keziah looked at the growing woodpile without comfort. She knew that no amount of firewood would matter if the cabin couldn't hold the heat. Love alone would not carry her children through another Wyoming winter. This time, survival would demand a better design. Keziah's cabin looked proper from the outside. Log walls, clay and grass chinking, a low stone hearth, plank flooring laid over packed earth, a roof patched with tarred canvas and split shingles. It was the kind of shelter people trusted, because it looked like every other cabin that had stood through winter. But when the north wind came down Cold Larch Draw, the place turned into a sieve. Cold slipped under the floorboards. Frost gathered along the base logs. The door shook through the night. When the wind shifted hard, smoke pushed back down the chimney and rolled low across the room. Keziah stuffed rags into cracks. She hung quilts on the walls. She pressed moss into failing chinking. Still, the cabin lost heat faster than the hearth could make it. So she began writing numbers. Outside, 18 degrees. Cabin floor before dawn, 29 degrees. Hearth still warm, but the air falling. Then one short line beneath it. Fire works hard. Room does not keep it. One evening in late October, Keziah crossed the yard to check the horses. The wind cut hard across her face. It moved like a blade through the draw, but the moment she stepped inside the horse barn, the air changed. It was not warm like a room with a fire. It was steadier than that. The 3 horses stood in their stalls, heavy bodies giving off slow heat. The old mule breathed softly near the back wall. Above them, the oat straw loft sat thick and dry, holding warmth under the roof like a blanket. Along the north side, the earth bank pressed against the barn foundation and kept the worst wind from striking low. Keziah pulled off one glove to retie a halter. Her fingers did not go numb. That small fact stayed with her. She looked down at the barn floor, then up at the straw, then toward the animals shifting in the dim light. The barn was not making much heat. It was keeping what it had. The cabin lost warmth. The barn held it. The next morning, Keziah carried a length of twine, a carpenter's rule that had belonged to Harlan, and a piece of charcoal into the barn. She measured in silence. The best place was not beside the stalls. Manure brought moisture. Urine brought odor. Neither belonged near sleeping children. She also stayed well away from the wide barn doors where every winter wind forced its way inside. Instead, she marked the ground beneath the center of the oat straw loft, where the earth stayed firm and the roof carried the deepest layer of insulation. 9 feet wide, 13 feet long, 6 feet, 8 inches below the floor. Enough space for one rope bed, 2 small pallets, a narrow shelf, an oil lamp, a water crock, and a single trunk. It was never meant to be a root cellar. It was never meant to be a dugout. It was exactly this, a sleeping room under the barn if dry. That last condition mattered most. Cold could be endured. Dampness stayed longer. It settled into blankets, into timber, into lungs. Keziah understood that a warm room filled with moisture could become as dangerous as a freezing one. The idea was neither bold nor romantic. It would be hard to build, harder to explain. People would think she had lost her senses. Then Mira coughed again in her sleep. Keziah closed the ledger. From that moment forward, what looked proper no longer mattered. Only what would keep her children alive did. Early November brought the first hard mornings, and Keziah began digging. She worked after feeding the horses, before breakfast, and again while Caleb stayed with Mira. Cold larch draw did not give up its ground easily. The first foot was dense clay, packed tight by years of weather. Beneath it lay scattered stones, tangled with dry sagebrush roots that caught every swing of the mattock. Her tools were simple: a spade, a mattock, a dented bucket, an old rope loop worn smooth by years of hauling hay. One bucket at a time. The dirt came up through a temporary opening in the barn floor. Instead of leaving a growing pile that might invite questions, Keziah spread the soil across shallow depressions behind the barn where spring runoff always collected. From a distance, nothing looked unusual. Caleb carried only the lighter buckets. Whenever he offered to climb into the excavation, Keziah refused. The walls had not been secured yet, and loose earth gave no warning before it moved. Some mornings her hands were blistered before sunrise. By evening, her shoulders ached, her back felt stiff, and dirt filled the cracks beneath her fingernails. Still, she spoke to no one outside her family. Every shovel of earth was another promise made in silence. Only the ledger recorded her progress. Down another 4 inches. North wall holds. The words were plain. So was the work. Every inch below the barn carried her family one step farther from the life that had almost failed them once already. When the pit reached its proper depth, Keziah stopped digging down and began building inward. She hauled creek shale from the wash south of the homestead and gathered flat fieldstone from the slope beyond the barn. The stones were not pretty. Some were thin and sharp. Others were heavy, stubborn pieces that had to be rolled instead of lifted. But they had weight, and weight could be useful if a person understood how to set it. Harlan had once told her that a dry stacked wall should not stand stiff and straight like a fence. It needed a slight inward lean. That way, gravity helped hold the face together instead of pulling it apart. So Keziah laid each course carefully, stone against stone, broad face down. Narrow gaps filled with smaller chips. Behind the wall, she packed clay mixed with chopped straw, pressing it tight in layers so loose earth could not crumble into the chamber. The floor came next. She tamped clay until it hardened underfoot. But she did not make it level. A level floor looked neat. A useful floor moved water. Keziah sloped it gently toward the southwest corner, where she dug a gravel drain pocket nearly 18 inches deep. She lined it with creek pebbles, cold ash, and small willow twigs, giving seep water a place to fall instead of spreading beneath the beds. A warm room was not enough. If it stayed damp, it would still fail. A cold rain passed through cold larch draw in the middle of November. The next morning, Keziah climbed down into the unfinished chamber with her lantern. She stopped after only 2 steps. A dark stain marked the western wall. It was not large, barely the length of her hand. No water dripped onto the floor. Nothing smelled damp. Many people might have looked at it once and walked away. Keziah did not. If the wall accepted moisture during a cold autumn rain, it would accept far more when spring snow began to melt. She never told herself it would probably be fine. Instead, she climbed back outside, peeled away part of the clay backing behind that section of wall, and dug a shallow diversion trench around the western side of the barn. Any runoff would now circle the foundation instead of pressing against it. She packed fresh clay mixed with wood ash and chopped straw into the repaired seam, forcing every handful tightly into place before rebuilding the outer bank. Inside the chamber, she pressed an old strip of linen against the dark mark and left it there overnight. The next morning she unfolded the cloth. It was dry, not perfectly clean, but dry. The stain had stopped spreading. That evening, Caleb asked if something had gone wrong. Keziah nodded once, only a place that needed an answer. She noted down another short line. West corner answered. Watch after thaw. The repair brought no celebration. Only confidence earned the difficult way. Every weakness found before winter was one less weakness the blizzard could discover later. The walls could not protect anyone if the ceiling failed. Keziah walked to the remains of an old wagon shed that had collapsed during the previous spring's windstorm. Most people saw rotten lumber. She saw seasoned beams that still carried strength. After cutting away the split ends, she hauled each timber back to the barn, one load at a time. The main beams ran across the chamber, crossing the direction of the barn floor joists instead of following them. Harlan had once explained that crossing the load spread the weight instead of concentrating it. Keziah remembered. She seated every beam inside shallow stone pockets built into the chamber walls. The ceiling would not depend on nails alone. It would rest on stone. Above those beams would stand 3 horses, 1 old mule, stacks of oat straw, and the constant movement of winter chores. Then she designed the entrance. Not an outside door, not a stairwell, not even a hatch anyone could notice. She built a rectangular opening, barely 32 by 38 inches, beneath the oat storage bin. When closed, its planks matched the surrounding floor so closely that it looked like nothing more than the bottom of the feed bin. Anyone walking across the barn would never suspect a room existed beneath their boots. No outside door meant no drifting snow against a threshold. No exposed stairwell meant no chimney for cold air. No visible opening gave the coming blizzard a place to attack. Keziah closed the hatch and stepped back. It disappeared. She looked at the ordinary barn floor and understood something that words could never fully capture. The wind could not steal warmth from a door it could never touch. Warmth underground was useless if the air turned bad. Keziah understood that before she ever lit the first test fire, a closed room below a barn could hold heat, but it could also hold smoke. Worse than smoke, it could hold the kind of poison no one smelled until it was too late. So she bought short, mismatched sections of 6-inch clay tile pipe from Orson Pike's general store. They were chipped pieces, too uneven for proper drainage work, which made them cheap enough for her to carry home. She fitted them through a wall cavity, then angled the pipe out the leeward side of the barn, where it looked like nothing more than a feed room vent. The stove box was just as modest. No grand fireplace, no wide mouth eating wood. Only a small clay-lined firebox in the corner, built to take split kindling, and a few narrow pieces of cottonwood. On the first test, the smoke did not draw. It hesitated. It curled low across the chamber, gray and bitter, and Caleb coughed hard before Keziah snatched the burning sticks out with iron tongs and smothered them in ash. She threw open the hatch and waited until the bad air lifted. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she fixed it. She added a short vertical rise before the pipe turned sideways. She cut a small preheat hole and shaped a tin funnel from scrap so she could warm the flue before lighting the stove box. After that, She touched flame to a twist of paper near the opening and watched the draft pull clean. The second test burned clear. The smoke went where it was told to go. Only then did Keziah let the children come close again. The chamber was never designed to fight winter. It was designed to ignore it. The earth surrounding the room stayed steadier than the air above. Nearly 7 feet below the surface, the ground surrendered its warmth slowly and accepted new heat just as slowly. The stone walls and packed clay did the same. They were not heaters. They were storage. Above the ceiling, 3 horses and 1 old mule breathed through the long Wyoming nights, their body heat rising into the oat straw loft before settling gently through the heavy timber floor. Nearly 9 feet of dry straw formed a thick blanket beneath the roof. The little stove box had only one job. Each evening, Keziah burned a small fire for about 2 hours. The flame warmed the stone, the clay, and the earth around them. After that, the room carried the heat by itself. She built a cedar sleeping platform 16 inches above the floor, where the coldest air naturally settled below. She recorded the results. Outside, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Barn, 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Chamber before fire, 46 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 hours after the fire, 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The numbers were modest, but they proved something important. Heat kept was worth more than heat made. The room was finally ready. Keziah stretched rope across a simple wooden bed frame and laid a straw tick on top. Beside it, she arranged 2 small pallets for Caleb and Mira. A narrow shelf held an oil lamp, a Bible, and the family ledger. A water crock stood beside the wall. Their clothes fit inside one weathered trunk. A thick wool curtain divided the children's sleeping corner from the rest of the chamber. Nothing about the room looked proper. The ceiling was the underside of the barn floor. Sometimes the slow thud of horse hooves echoed overhead. The walls were nothing but stone, clay, and warm lamplight. Caleb looked around and quietly called it the underroom. Mira tilted her head. "Are we going to live like foxes?" Keziah smiled for the first time in weeks. Foxes stay alive because they know where the wind cannot reach. She did not move the family underground all at once. The first night was only a test. Then another. Then another. Each morning she checked the bedding, the walls, the air, and finally Mira. The coughing had not disappeared, but it had softened. The little girl slept longer. She woke with warm hands instead of icy fingers. No celebration followed. Only another careful note in the ledger. Sometimes the smallest victory was simply hearing a child breathe quietly until sunrise. People noticed long before anyone asked questions. One late afternoon, Rowan Bellwether, a neighboring homesteader whose farm bordered Keziah's property, rode past her place on his way home and saw her carrying folded bedding into the horse barn. He slowed for only a moment before riding on. That evening, he mentioned it to his wife over supper. By the next church gathering, someone else repeated the story. Lydia Sallow, the local schoolteacher, paused halfway through pouring coffee. "She's sleeping in the barn?" "No," another woman answered quietly. "Under it." The room fell silent for a moment, then someone sighed. "I suppose Harlan's death has been harder on her than anyone realized." No one laughed. That almost made it worse. People pitied her. Before long, a new name drifted through cold Larch Draw. The barn-buried woman. Others whispered that children should never sleep beneath livestock. A few wondered if grief had clouded her judgment. The words eventually reached the schoolyard. One afternoon, another boy wrinkled his nose at Caleb and said, "Your house smells like horses." Caleb said nothing. He walked home more quietly than usual, kicked the dirt once outside the barn, and disappeared inside the underroom without asking a single question. Keziah noticed. She knew where those words had come from. She also knew that arguments never changed minds. Only winters did. A few days later, Keziah stopped at Orson Pike's general store to buy lamp oil and another length of stovepipe. Orson rested both hands on the counter before speaking. "I've sold clay tile to folks before," he said. "One family built a root cellar that looked fine until the spring thaw. Water came in. Potatoes rotted. Their children coughed for weeks from the damp." His voice held no mockery, only concern. "I'd hate to see that happen again." Keziah thanked him and simply replied that she had planned for drainage. She offered nothing more. The second warning came from someone whose opinion carried even greater weight. Ephraim Vale, an elderly settler, had survived more Wyoming winters than almost anyone in the valley. He had buried neighbors, rebuilt cabins, and watched storms humble men far stronger than himself. He stopped beside Keziah while she split firewood. "I hear you've moved your family underground." "Beneath the barn," she answered. He nodded slowly. "Damp ground ruins lungs. Freeze and thaw can move walls. Smoke in a closed room kills people before they wake." Every warning was reasonable. Every warning had happened somewhere. Keziah listened without interrupting. "I built drainage," she said. "The chamber vents clean. I've tested the draft." Ephraim looked toward the barn but did not walk closer. After a long silence, he rested both hands on the top of his axe. "Maybe." Then he looked toward the gray northern sky. "Winter will measure it." He tipped his hat and rode away. Keziah watched him disappear down the road. She did not feel insulted. She understood exactly what he meant. The storm would not care about confidence. It would only care about what worked. By early December, the chamber had proven warm enough. That did not mean it was finished. After 3 trial nights, Keziah found beads of water clinging beneath a cold beam near the hatch. They were small, but they were there. The lower edge of Mira's blanket felt faintly damp where it hung too close to the floor. Keziah touched the fabric, then the beam, then wrote nothing for several minutes. Moisture had found a place to gather. A few mornings later, Caleb discovered tiny tracks in the dust near the oat bin hatch. Mice had found interest in the same hidden space that protected the family. Keziah answered both problems. She hung a wool curtain at the foot of the ladder, creating a simple air baffle so cold air would not drop straight from the hatch onto the beds. She spread a thin layer of cool wood ash beneath the cedar sleeping riser to pull dampness downward before it reached the bedding. On the leeward side of the chamber, she cut a narrow cross-vent slit and fitted it with a sliding wood cover, so the room could breathe without surrendering all its warmth. Then she wrapped the oat bin legs with tin scrap. Every mouse gap was packed with horsehair and clay. No fix looked impressive by itself, but frontier survival rarely depended on impressive things. It depended on small weaknesses being answered before they became large ones. For the next week, Keziah checked the room before sunrise. Bedding dry. Smoke draw steady. Morning temperature without a night fire. 47 to 49 degrees. She did not celebrate. Beneath the newly recorded numbers, she drew one firm line and carefully wrote 2 words. Holds better. On the morning of January 7, 1890, something changed. Not with a sound, with a feeling. The horses stood unusually still inside the barn. The old mule turned its hindquarters toward the door and refused to face the north. Even before sunrise, the air felt heavier, as though the valley itself had stopped breathing. Keziah stepped outside with her thermometer and notebook. Outside, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, north wind steady, sky hard white, nothing else. By afternoon, the temperature slipped below 0. The snow no longer drifted downward. It moved sideways. Hour after hour, the wind drove it across the valley, until the ground and the sky became the same color. By the second night, drifts had climbed as high as fence rails. Cabin chimneys disappeared beneath packed snow. Doors froze shut. Men crossed their own yards to feed livestock and returned without feeling their fingers. The storm grew stronger. There was no bargain to make with it. It measured every wall that leaked air, every roof that surrendered heat, every chimney that lost its draft, every stack of firewood cut too small, every pair of lungs forced to breathe cold through another endless night. It even measured pride. Across Cold Larch Draw, every family believed its shelter had been built well enough. Now, each one would have to prove it. Inside the barn, Keziah lowered the hidden hatch for what she hoped would be the last time before the storm passed. Caleb carried the ledger. Mira held the oil lamp with both hands. The horses settled quietly overhead while the old mule shifted once against its stall. Nothing more could be added. Nothing more could be repaired. The work was finished. Now the blizzard would decide whether it had been enough. The blizzard did not break every home at once. It wore them down. Rowan Bellwether fed his stove from dawn until long after dark. Split log after split log disappeared into the firebox, yet the thermometer hanging beside his window refused to climb much above 34 degrees. His wife heated smooth river stones beside the stove, wrapped them in wool cloth, and tucked them beneath the blankets for their children. Before midnight, the stones were cold again. Then Rowan counted what remained of his woodpile. If the storm lasted much longer, February would arrive before enough firewood did. Across the valley, Ephraim Vale faced a different problem. His cabin was larger than most, but its broad, shallow fireplace consumed wood almost as quickly as it produced heat. Much of the warmth escaped straight up the chimney. His elderly father sat close to the hearth, wrapped in quilts, coughing deeper with every passing day. At the schoolhouse cabin, Lydia Sallow smelled smoke before she saw it. Snow had packed around the chimney cap until the draft nearly stopped. Smoke rolled back into the room. She threw open the front door to clear the air. The wind answered instantly. Snow blasted across the floor. Cold rushed inside. She had to choose smoke or freezing air. Everywhere in Cold Larch Draw, people began sacrificing comfort simply to keep breathing. Rocking chairs disappeared into fireplaces. Shelves were torn from walls for kindling. Livestock bedding was packed against doors to slow the drafts. Blankets were nailed over windows. Families crowded into single rooms because heating an entire cabin had become impossible. No one mentioned the barn-buried woman anymore, not because opinions had changed, because the cold had stolen the time for opinions. The storm cared nothing for what looked proper. It only exposed what could no longer keep a family warm. By the third day, the wind eased for less than an hour. Not enough to call it calm, only enough to let people look beyond their own windows. Rowan Bellwether stepped onto his porch and scanned the white valley. One cabin after another still carried a thin ribbon of smoke into the gray sky. Then he looked toward Keziah's homestead. Her cabin was dark. The horse barn stood half buried beneath drifting snow. There was no smoke. No movement. No one crossed the yard. On the frontier, a silent chimney during a blizzard usually meant only one thing. Something had gone terribly wrong. That night, Rowan lay awake listening to the wind scrape against his walls. He remembered the whispers from church, the barn-buried woman. The words no longer sounded foolish. They sounded dangerous. Before daylight on the fourth morning, the thermometer still rested below minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind had weakened enough for snowshoes. Rowan wrapped a wool scarf over his face until only his eyes remained visible. He filled a small flask with hot water, wrapped it inside an old blanket to keep it from freezing, and started toward Keziah's place. Nearly 2.5 miles separated the homesteads. Every step disappeared into drifting snow. Every fence had become a white ridge. More than once, Rowan lost sight of the trail completely. Still, he kept walking. He told himself someone had to know, someone had to look. As the buried barn slowly emerged through the blowing snow, Rowan prepared himself for the sight he feared most. A hidden room filled with smoke. Or a mother and 2 children who had trusted the wrong idea one winter too many. It took Rowan several minutes to force the barn door open. Packed snow resisted every pull until the frozen latch finally gave way. The air inside was cold, but not brutally cold. 3 horses lifted their heads as he entered. The old mule shifted once, then settled again. Fresh hay rested beneath the feed rack. Water buckets had been broken free of ice only recently. Someone had been here. Someone was alive. Then a small voice drifted up through the floor. "Mama, is that Mr. Bellwether?" Rowan froze. A narrow wooden panel beneath the oat bin swung open. Keziah climbed up the ladder, lantern in one hand. Her face looked tired, but clear. Her cheeks were pink instead of pale. There was no panic in her eyes. No frostbite on her hands. Only quiet attention. "You'd better come down," she said. Rowan removed his gloves and lowered himself through the hidden hatch. The warmth reached him before his boots touched the floor. Not hot, not stuffy, simply warm. Warm enough that his shoulders relaxed without thinking. Warm enough that breathing no longer hurt. The little stove box sat silent in the corner. Only cool gray ashes remained inside. Caleb slept peacefully on one pallet. Mira rested beneath a single blanket instead of a mountain of quilts. On the wall, beside the ledger, a thermometer stood perfectly still. 56 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the valley hovered near -31 degrees Fahrenheit. For a long time, Rowan said nothing. He slowly unwound the wool scarf from around his face. The silence carried more respect than any apology ever could. After a while, Rowan finally asked the only question that mattered. "How?" Keziah did not answer with a speech. She pointed. First to the stone wall. "Feel it." It was warmer than the air outside had any right to allow. Then she showed him the cedar sleeping platform, dry beneath the blankets. The thin layer of wood ash hidden below it. The wool curtain hanging beside the ladder, stopping cold air from pouring directly onto the beds. Finally, she lit a narrow strip of paper near the vent. The flame leaned steadily toward the flue. The draft was clean. Then she handed him the ledger. Every day was there. Outside temperature, room temperature, fire time, wood used, small repairs, small improvements. During 4 days of the blizzard, Keziah had burned about 1/6 of a cord of wood, almost entirely during short evening fires. Rowan thought about his own cabin. Nearly 2 cords had disappeared into his fireplace. His family had still shivered. Keziah closed the ledger. "The room keeps what the fire gives." That was all she said. Only then did Rowan understand. He had tried to survive the storm by making more heat. Keziah had survived because she refused to let the storm steal the heat she already had. When the blizzard finally loosened its grip, Rowan told the story exactly as he had seen it, not as a miracle, as a measurement. A few days later, Ephraim Vale arrived carrying only a measuring rule. He said little. He measured the wall thickness, the vent angle, the hatch opening, and the height of the cedar sleeping platform. Lydia Sallow came with a notebook instead of questions. The woman once called the barn-buried woman was now being copied line by line. Orson Pike soon ordered more clay tile, stove brick, tin scrap, and lamp wicks than he had ever stocked before. Some families converted root cellars into winter rooms. Others built sheltered sleeping chambers beneath small stables. A few copied the wool baffle and the ash beneath the beds. No one copied Keziah exactly. They copied the principles. Years passed. When Caleb built his own homestead, he chose a different design. His sleeping room was only partly below ground, but it still rested on the same ideas: raised floors, controlled ventilation, double hatches, and walls that held heat instead of wasting it. Mira grew into a healthy young woman. Later, while teaching children in a small settlement school, she kept a handwritten copy of her mother's ledger. The pages still carried weather notes, repair records, temperatures, and one short phrase written more than once. Holds better. Keziah Thorneby never became famous. Yet in Cold Larch Draw, people slowly stopped saying barn-buried woman with pity. Instead, they remembered the winter when one quiet mother understood something the storm could not argue with. Keziah never invented earth sheltering. Long before Wyoming was settled, people had trusted earth, thermal mass, dugouts, and sheltered rooms to survive difficult climates. What made her story different was not the idea itself, but how carefully she adapted it to her own circumstances. One horse barn, one thick oat loft, clay soil, limited firewood, 2 children depending on every decision. She did not overcome nature through strength. She survived because she respected its rules. Wind steals what it can touch. Water must always be given a place. Smoke must always be given a path. Heat must always be given something to stay inside. Nature never negotiated. When the blizzard arrived, it judged every design without favor. Keziah had simply prepared her answer before winter asked the question.